Hello to all of you who are in the room. Hello also to those of you who are listening through our live stream. I want to start with conveying the apologies of Joan Benag, who is the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Pompeu Fabra University Public Policy Center. He was going to give a brief introduction, but he cannot make it due to a very last-minute institutional commitment that came up. Joan conveys you a very warm welcome. So, good morning from me. I want to address a very warm welcome to all of you for our two-day conference on green colonialism and green sacrifice here at Universidad Pompeu Fabra. Just a couple of words about the idea of this conference and what we're trying to do. So the idea for the conference originates from the desire to bring together colleagues who are both interested in pushing the limits of critical research on the so-called green transitions or decarbonization, and at the same time are concerned about what sort of transformative politics are relevant in times of a warming planet and growing inequality and injustice. In the last years, we have seen the emergence of large-scale schemes ostensibly for addressing the climate crisis, schemes such as the European Green Deal, which are at a scale that many of us 10 years ago would probably not even imagine as possible. But at the same time, communities all around the world have evidenced how colonial legacies and global capitalism may end up shaping much needed climate action, reminding us that although transition is inevitable, justice is not, as pointed out by social movements. In that context, the last 5 to 6 years have also seen an increase in published research on the colonial dimensions of green transitions, with a particular emphasis on both the material and equal exchange side of that phenomenon and its epistemological or coloniality aspects. Many of you here today have made significant contributions to that work. Some of those dynamics are captured here in our conference, side by side with research on new dynamics connected to green colonialism. For example, the operation of imperial dynamics through decarbonization and the perpetuation of extractivist logics and practices through green transition and green sacrifice, as well as corporate practices within that context, are some of the conference's themes. At the same time, colleagues in this conference will be discussing ways in which decarbonization attempts and green transition projects have not managed to disconnect from the exercise of epistemic violence, and how this is nevertheless contested, resisted, and challenged. Now, the small format of the conference reflects our intention to create a space of encounter and exchange of ideas that will allow you to advance your research and connections with colleagues. A key aspiration of this conference is to provide spaces for talking to each other, listening, debating, and if that's desired, for constructing avenues for further discussions and collaborations after the event. Now, conference sessions have a variety of formats to stimulate such interactions. We are thrilled to have our opening keynote delivered by Miriam Lang in a few minutes, and a closing roundtable discussion with Uli Brandt, Vasna Ramasar, and Sofia Avila. We also have presentations on cutting-edge issues delivered by a mix of younger and more senior scholars. A presentation of our research project Green Sacrifice in Spain, with the acronym GRES, which is funded by the Spanish Research Agency and EU's Next Generation funds, which also fund this event. And last but not least, a space dedicated to discussions for developing common projects or freely reflecting upon pressing questions, concerns, or common interests. We have also made provisions to leave 30 minutes for our coffee breaks, and so allow for conversations stimulated by plenary and parallel sessions to continue in a more relaxed atmosphere. So we hope that the next 2 days can provide you with an opportunity to engage in personally, professionally, and politically meaningful conversations and reflections for future action, research, writing, and collaborations. I want to encourage you to please make the conference your space for advancing such conversations with colleagues, making use of conference spaces, and not only sessions, but also importantly, as I said, coffee breaks and lunches to communicate, ask and answer questions, and of course, fruitfully enjoy your time here in Barcelona. I will now pass the word to my colleague Angelina Cusi, who has been heading the organization of this event, putting lots of hours and energy for its coordination and for making it happen. So thank you and enjoy the conference.
Okay, thank you, Christos, and thank you because all that started by your impulse and as part of your project. It wasn't easy to get here. For all the imperfections on this bumpy road, please accept our apologies. We did our best with the resources we had. Our immense gratefulness to those who gave a helping hand in the last stretch, already having a lot of their own plate. Joanna Morrison, Ferran Montaner, Joan Benac, Arnau Quinquia, Avery Bones, Tiameta Brandax, Eliana Martínez Herrera, Linda Velázquez, Claudia Torrens, Mariana Gutiérrez Zamora, Laila Vivas, Humberto Jiménez, Josep Carlos Armayones, thank you. This is not the ceremonial thank you, but the one that really does not take for granted your time, effort, and warm support. The very same kind of thank you and credits to Maria Janet Bautista and Angela Lodoño for beautiful graphic design for the conference materials. This is the fourth event organized by the Public Policy Center during the last 40 days and the third consecutive. Please be gentle to those who keep maintaining it all for us with the last of their energy. Some sacrifices are futile, useless. Maurice Bloch suggested that these are those that represent the ultimate expression of power. But other sacrifices bring postponing time, but a great gratification. My personal one is to see now this community of engaged scholars in one place. Because these are difficult times. In History and Memory, Maria Zambrano wrote that the past is neither remembered nor actualized, but rather it remains there. In this historical moment, again, the violence of colonial and patriarchal mindset and modus operandi express itself much harshly. We know from many authors, from Latin American countries, from Europe, that capitalism of whatever color it was born thanks to colonization, and that it reproduces itself with its support. The same we know from Federici and many other authors about patriarchy. In this symbiotic relationship, sacrifice is a very important element. This all institution to maintain hierarchical relationships to live at expense of others. When the industrial military complex and the global community in power reach the external planetary limits, it seeks more internal sacrifices. Here we talk about the green sacrifice, but it's entangled with many others, the precarious lives, scapegoating of those most vulnerable, and the genocide as the maximum expression of it. Thank you for your presence. It's a privilege to think with such great minds about the way the power works, same as to share the duty and responsibility to find effective strategies to practice a different mode of provisioning, living, being, and relating to each other. Please receive the following instructions as an act of care. If you need Wi-Fi, use the guest account of the Pompeu Fabra University and follow the instruction that come up when you select the network. The signal that in the building is terrible, so you might need to go outside to receive the text message with code. And it will, if this what I said is not clear enough, please find the email from us with Wi-Fi in the title. And keep your personal belongings with you as the campus is open and anyone can come. If you want to use social media, our friends put some hashtags and information here to help you to write about what we are thinking here and doing. If you need bathrooms, some of them are there, other ones are there. If you need water, you can go there, see the signal of the men's bathroom on the left and keep going straight ahead. If at any point you feel a bit lost and need some assistance, in the registration table are our colleagues happy to help. Additional appreciation also goes to all of you who came from very far away. Our keynote speaker, Miriam Lang, and her discussant, Carol Tornel, are among them. I'm originally from Poland, so I've read quite a lot of diaries of people who, during the Second World War, were writing their reflections on the fact that there is something deeply wrong with the cultural and moral base of Europe that leads to such barbarism. And we can say here, there's something really wrong with the basic concepts on which the institutions and infrastructures of the globally imposed Western modernity sit. It was very important for us to have Miriam here. We needed someone to think from the South. And yes, I know Miriam is from Germany. When this was mentioned in the conference in Mexico at the Congress of Political Ecology, a Chilean friend of mine said, no, 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 no. It's very clear for us that Miriam is a thinker, an intellectualist, an activist from the South. Same is Carol Tornel. Dr. Miriam Lang is an academic activist holding PhD in sociology from the Free University of Berlin. She's working at the Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar in Ecuador, focusing her research on critique of development and territorial implementations of El Buen Vivir. She is involved in the work of the Latin American Permanent Working Group on Alternatives to Development, and an inspiration and a model for those interested in feminist, radically transformative and decolonial political ecology. Carlos Tornel holds PhD in Human Geography from the University of Durham in the UK. He's at the front of the global tapestry of alternatives and focuses his research and practice or critical perspectives on low carbon infrastructures for the so-called green transition. He's a member of various grassroots and academic networks advocating for equitable energy futures. Without any doubt, within the scholarship on the topic and in the School of Life, as activist in Rosario in Argentina call it, he's broadening for us the horizons of thinking and acting. Wonderful, do it. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. How are you feeling? Well, it's cooler in here, isn't it? To begin with, I would like to thank you for this warm introduction and all of you for being part of this space of reflection, critique, and exchange around green colonialism and green sacrifice. I actually believe this conference is a relevant stepstone in European debates about what is commonly called a just transition. Also, of course, special thanks to Angelina, Christos, and all the people who have made this happen, and for inviting me to speak here. In 2022, only 3 years back, when with some friends and colleagues from the geopolitical South, we began to work on the book, The Geopolitics of Green Colonialism, one of our main motivations was that we sensed a striking lack of this kind of perspectives in the global North. In the European context, the launch of the Green Deal in late 2019 seemed to establish green growth as a new goal for the EU, with very little light shed on who would bear the social and environmental costs for that elsewhere. Even several Green New Deal proposals put forward by different leftist groups did not engage deeper into a perspective of global justice, although acknowledging the principle of differentiated but common responsibilities for climate change and that global warming was affecting most those who had historically contributed less to it. But the European political landscape just seemed to not allow diving deeper into what green growth would do to the territories and the peoples of the global South. So I believe that a first important starting point for our debates today and tomorrow is that there can be no real sustainability at all without global justice. In the following, I would like to quickly outline how we, at least the 3 editors of this book, which I did together with Marianne Manahan from the Philippines and Breno Bringle from Brazil, and many, many other people who are there writing, how we conceptualized green colonialism. In defining green colonialism as we understand it, we embed the concept in the long history of green colonialism. The long history of stripping people and societies in colonized territories of their own ways of relating to nature. For example, their ways of managing water, irrigation systems, or forests as commons, of producing food in a sustainable way. And we embed it in the long history of plunder, technological control, and domination of landscapes. Green colonialism is understood as associated with a historical pattern of colonial power and capitalist expansion, which lasts on until our days and only has shifted shapes on various occasions. Green colonialism was thus historically forged alongside with capitalism and the commodification of nature, combining material expansion and subjective control, which is expressed in concepts as the coloniality of nature. Whereas the ever-expansive movement to plunder and transform nature into so-called resources that are continuously fed from the peripheries into the industrial centers of capitalism could also be understood as ecological imperialism, as some authors have put it. Framing this as green colonialism allows us to acknowledge how rather old practices of appropriation and dispossession now take on a green facade by taking control of key elements in the process of creating green economies, such as minerals for electric vehicles or hectares of forest for carbon credits. This also highlights the fact that legal frameworks, instead of granting the dispossessed rights, in peripheral countries have historically served and continue to serve to legitimize processes of dispossession. In resonance with Quijano's work, it stresses the importance of the invention of race in this process that constituted the capitalist world order. Actually, as Farhana Sultana has shown, for example, the coloniality of power, knowledge, and being, as Quijano framed it, is all over the place when you look at climate policies, for example. But green colonialism today is truly a regime of appropriation. It has its own laws and regulation and is sustained by global institutions, especially the profoundly asymmetric global trade and investment rules, the dispute settlement mechanisms, the financial regulations and practices around sovereign debt, and the multi-stakeholder logic that has permeated multilateral institutions, prioritizing transnational corporations, banks, and investment funds, and thus streamlining its policies around profitability. And by framing these processes as green colonialism, we also wanted to highlight the huge material dimension of unequal exchange and value transfer from south to north. We identify that green colonialism currently unfolds at least in 4 dimensions, and each one of those re-edits forms of colonial appropriation. The first dimension is seeing and treating the Global South as a gigantic warehouse of all kinds of raw materials, especially those that would get more lucrative in the context of renewable energy markets. The second is seeing and treating the territories of the South as the territories to which the ecological costs of green growth would be externalized through compensation mechanisms in the context of carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and other green credits. The South would have to generate carbon sinks equivalent to the compensation needs of the capitalist centers, which would also shape forcefully conservation policies in peripheral countries in a certain way that is especially profitable for financial actors. The third dimension we categorized takes place in the context of so-called free trade agreements, where the global powers would also manage to externalize their waste by shipping it to southern countries, that is, including the toxic waste, which would be produced by the digitalization wave and the expansion of renewable energies. Finally, also within the existing asymmetric framework of global trade, the South would become a market for highly profitable, renewable and green technologies with value added and designs developed in the North. Many of the dynamics that framed the commodities consensus of the early 2000s in Latin America, for example, countries being put to compete against each other in order to service the raw material demand of global powers, instead of having leeway to build their own regional economies for the needs of their own populations and territories, are now re-edited in the context of what Breno Bringle and Maristela Svampa have framed as a decarbonization consensus. This is the case, for example, when German state actors and development agencies, alongside German corporations, encourage several countries in Latin America and Africa at the same time to engage in so-called green hydrogen, which often is far less green than is affirmed. Uruguay, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, South Africa, Namibia, each one of them is told that they have a unique comparative advantage because of, for example, certain biophysical characteristics or territories framed as empty through the colonial glance, and are being offered cooperation in building huge infrastructures that supposedly will also help the countries themselves to green their energy matrix. Only that, in the end, figures indicate that more than 80% of the hydrogen produced will be for export. And according to scientists from the peak in Potsdam, the demand that will eventually arise in Germany, for example, from industries like the chemical sector or steel, is not even really clear yet. Regardless of this, in all those countries of the South, eco-social conflict is already underway, with the local affected communities being deliberately sidelined from negotiations and planning. And once those infrastructures for hydrogen production are up, the local people, dispossessed of their territories, their material livelihoods, modes of living, and sense of belonging, all those countries will be competing with each other on the global hydrogen market in exactly the same way as they competed before, to sell their copper or other raw materials without being able to influence global prices. I'm sure that you all will bring many more examples to that in the following days. Now, it is also true that this ecological modernization through decarbonization, as put forward by the European Commission in 2019, by the Biden government in the US, and also by China, is only one of the hegemony projects that have arisen in the last year to confront the global environmental crisis, and that today coexist simultaneously. In the following, I would like to support this assertion with two arguments. First, I would like to state that there is no just transition whatsoever, although I am aware that not all authors of our book, for example, would agree to not reclaim that concept of a just transition for social movements. But there is no justice because of the huge asymmetries and colonial relations present in transition policies. And there is also no such thing as a transition, as Jean-Baptiste Fressow has shown in his brilliant history of modern energy. Dismantling the classic energy transition narrative, according to which humanity has evolved orderly from coal to oil, then to gas, and now to renewables, Freso shows that in practice, each new energy source rather has been added to the previous ones, not replaced them. Each energy source, coal, oil, gas, electricity, nuclear energy, renewables, instead of being displaced, still coexists and cooperates with the others, forming a hyper-energy system that intensifies and accelerates social metabolism. And indeed, despite the ongoing rhetoric of decarbonization, in the last years, there has been a blatant expansion of oil extraction and the power of associated transnational corporations. In its March 2025 monthly report, OPEC predicted that global oil demand would increase by 1.4 million barrels per day this year. Certainly, the war in Ukraine has contributed to this, but also the demand of so-called emerging economies in the global south. And Lula's new oil projects in the north of the Amazon, well, in the sea at the north of the Amazon, are just one sad example for this. So from this perspective, green capitalism just comes to add another layer of market opportunity to black and brown capitalism. It is not meant to replace it. And of course, it is important we understand that. And second, we have been witnessing how the decarbonization discourse has been increasingly challenged, and in some places, like the US, even displaced by the far right, in the context of a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape. Authoritarian forces are rising in many parts of the world. In the European Parliament, I'm told there are 21 far-right parties today. They govern in the United States, but also in Argentina and in global South power countries such as India. In Nicaragua and Venezuela, we see the perpetuation of authoritarian regimes that call themselves revolutionary leftists, but which use just the same tools and strategies as the far right against their people, stripping them of all kinds of rights. The environmental threat to life caused by what Ulrich Brandt and Markus Wissen have called the imperial mode of living is not only denied or relativized by these authoritarian right-wing forces, it is also ideologically redefined as a threat that supposedly comes from migrants and racialized bodies. Thus, we have moved from the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities with regard to climate change, as established in 1992, to the securitization and aggressive militarization, and to the vindication of exclusion as a climate policy program. The backdrop of this is unprecedented levels of inequality in the world, which are legitimized and naturalized by these discourses. To grasp where this logic can lead us, I would like to briefly turn to literature. In her strikingly prophetic 1991 cyberpunk feminist novel, He, She, and It, Marge Piercy imagines a world ravaged by ecological collapse, where elites live in high-tech domed corporate enclaves, shielded from the toxic world outside through huge glass domes. Inside these domes, privilege is preserved through corporate citizenship and patriarchal control. Outside, in what Piercy calls the glop, the vast ruins of abandoned urban landscapes, people struggle to survive amidst environmental decay, gang rule, and total abandonment. The multis, as Piercy calls the corporations, have replaced states. Citizens have become personnel. Profit is the only law. Piercy's fictional world feels disturbingly close to our present. A political essay recently published in The Guardian by Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor, The Rise of End Times Fascism, echoes Piercy's vision, though without that veil of fiction. They describe how global elites are actually building a movement for corporate city-states, where super-rich, tax-averse people can have their own high-tech fiefdoms or pro-business freedom cities. They give the example of Prospera, a gated community on an island lying in front of the shores of Honduras, which is already on the way in this direction and is currently sued by the Honduran state. According to Klein and Taylor, all of a sudden, this once fringe network of corporate secessionists finds itself knocking on open doors at the center of global power. Figures like Peter Thiel, I quote, have been championing the principle that those with means have the right to walk away from the obligations of citizenship, especially taxes and burdensome regulation. Retooling and rebranding old ambitions and privileges of empires, they dream of splintering governments and carving the world into hyper-capitalist, democracy-free havens under sole control of the supremely wealthy, protected by private mercenaries, serviced by AI robots, and financed by cryptocurrencies. End of quote. What is new is the openness, the shamelessness with which these proposals are being put forward, like Donald Trump's horrific fantasy to transform Gaza in a new Riviera resort, which is currently being put to practice by genocide. What emerges here is the vision of a planetary landscape organized around climate apartheid. Green enclaves of protection and privilege for the few, while the many, particularly racialized, poor, or land-connected peoples, are displaced, policed, or erased. Unfortunately, this does not sound as unlikely today as it may have only a few years ago. So what does this mean for our discussions here about green colonialism and green sacrifice? I believe it's important to state that even in the event of its relativization through the rise of the right and the continuity of brown and black capitalism, green capitalism has not disappeared and will not disappear. It is still a reality we have to confront. It is true that, for example, the European Green Deal is undergoing partial reversals, selective slowdowns, and strategic recalibrations. Those are largely driven by geopolitical pressures, inflationary concerns, social pushback, and shifting political dynamics, especially after the 2024 European Parliament elections. But there are also important continuities. Although this is not a field I really do research on, I would like to briefly mention some tendencies with the focus on Europe, where we are now. First, the EU is pushing ahead with free trade agreements, which are not only about liberalized trade, as we know, but are now aligning even more with the goal of strategic autonomy for Europe and raw material access priorities. Countries like Indonesia, Chile, Namibia, and Kazakhstan are being prioritized in those trade negotiations, particularly to gain access to nickel, copper, and rare earths. The EU is willing to soften environmental and labor conditionalities it was putting forward before in order to secure these materials. This also has shown lately in the negotiations with the Mercosur. So green diplomacy now competes with geopolitical imperatives, especially the need to counter Chinese and US influence. Second, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, originally introduced by the EU as a climate tool, is increasingly perceived as green protectionism. Obviously, in a context where countries in the geopolitical south are being courted for raw materials, in which all dirty industries have long been outsourced to southern territories with neoliberal globalization, and in which 80% of the global industrial workforce lives in the South, this is an instrument that deepens global injustices. Finally, the Critical Raw Materials Act that was passed in 2023 is being operationalized more aggressively in 2025. There is an acceleration of extractive strategies in the context of a de-risking logic to reduce the dependency on China for minerals like rare earth and graphite. These leads to European investments in mining, especially in Africa, for example, Zambia, Namibia, in Latin America, for example, Chile and Argentina, and the Balkans. And the Global Gateway Initiative is there, used to align European development aid with the goal to secure mineral supply chains. This happens simultaneously with a global shock on funding sources for social organizations in the global south in the aftermath of Donald Trump's and Elon Musk's chainsaw applied to US aid. Although we have never sympathized with US aid, its erasure is having very serious and extensively branched consequences on the funding of NGOs in the geopolitical south, who, for example, have supported anti-extractivist struggles with advocacy or legal advice. This is accompanied by a wave of new legislation, presidential decrees, or administrative and financial regulations, which can only be described as harassment to civil society organizations. All of this combined restricts the political room of maneuver of this kind of organizations, as well as civil and political rights. For example, in Peru, it is now forbidden to sue the state in lawsuits under the threat of being categorized as a terrorist. In general, accusations of terrorism or support for terrorism are being used to restrict all kinds of rights. In Latin America, we can observe these tendencies in countries across all colors of the political spectrum. They take place in Chile, Peru, Ecuador, El Salvador, Venezuela, or Nicaragua, with governments apparently directly learning successful authoritarian strategies from each other, how to intimidate, restrain, and criminalize eco-social opposition movements. Another terrifying phenomenon plaguing Latin America today is the swift expansion of criminal economies and their culture of violence and death. They rapidly transform societies that were very peaceful until recently, as Ecuador, for example, and even in places where there is no fascist or ultra-libertarian discourse in power. In Ecuador, at the beginning of this year, 2025, there was 1 homicide per hour. I believe it's very important to acknowledge for us here that today, this violent criminal economy is one of the most dynamic driving forces behind extractivism. It can be much more dynamic in some sectors and territories than official corporate extractivism, although it also maintains ties and is sometimes backed by corporations. This is the case, for example, in informal gold mining in the whole Amazon basin, whether in Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, or Brazil. I warmly recommend to read the series of excellent reports issued by Amazon Watch on that topic. The trafficking of gold, drugs, weapons, and bodies is interwoven in the same circuits of hidden capitalism, now impossible to untangle from the so-called legal economies with which they maintain multiple links, not only through money laundering and tax havens. These criminal economic circuits generously contribute to gross domestic product figures, while instilling violence and fear in daily life, eroding the social fabric and the possibilities of resistance, social organization, and political action. Many societies, such as those in Ecuador and Venezuela, for example, already live in a permanent state of emergency, which means the permanent suspension of civil rights and lasting militarization. In the light of all these recent developments, I am under the impression that our conceptualizations of sacrifice zones might even require new dimensions and new meanings. I would like to end this talk with a look toward our own strategies. As researchers and knowledge producers, but also as teachers and as humans sensible for injustices of all kinds. Political ecology and ecological economy have stressed the fact that environmental and social justice are intrinsically linked. I would like to expand this idea further toward a vision of multidimensional, intersectional global justice. It is evident that green colonialism and green sacrifice are built on the idea of race. And it is also evident today that the thriving far right builds on exacerbated hegemonic masculinity and patriarchy. It is even physically impersonated by a small group of super wealthy, predominantly white males, which pretend to have no ties to or responsibilities toward whatsoever community or collective, and defend both the violent exclusion of the majority world and the further depredation of nature as ultimate freedom. Never has it been so evident as today that colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and anthropocentrism are building pillars of this capitalist modern Western civilization, and that we have to challenge them all together, as well as their mutual intersections and imbrications. If the political far right is successfully resignifying ideas of rebellion and systemic change in ways that dismiss core human values such as empathy and collaborations, it is paramount that we counter this move with radical systemic alternatives, that we have something to propose and engage with. Because we are all actors in the dispute of how our societies will respond to this multidimensional systemic and civilizational crisis we are experiencing. And of course, beyond modernizing decarbonization and the militarized climate apartheid that the far right is envisioning, as Christos already mentioned, there are manifold actors who in the midst of this challenging situation are working on a third, radically different strategy. It has been called Solidary Perspectives by Ulrich Brandt and Markus Wissen in their latest book, or Eco-Territorial Internationalism by Sabrina Fernandez and Breno Bringle in our Green Colonialism book. And we can put several names on it. One of the pathways that I see laid out in this direction is acknowledging multidimensional debts and reparations. Actually, I would like to propose a shift in discourse away from the development paradigm as the paradigm that has predominantly organized North-South relations for more than 8 decades now and is so tightly interwoven with the expansion of capitalist growth and with unequal exchange toward a paradigm of reparations. Acknowledging multidimensional debts means acknowledging all the unpaid work, all the value, all the processes that have supported capital accumulation from underwater in ecofeminist Maria Mies's famous image of the iceberg economy. The work of millions of slaves, the work of women, the forced labor of indigenous people and children, the informal work which keeps many southern economies afloat, the subsistence work and communitarian work which generates infrastructure and satisfies needs in a significant way, and for this reason is constantly aggressed by the forces of capital, and of course, the highly complex works of more than human nature. Acknowledging multidimensional debts in a perspective of intersectional global justice means acknowledging not only ecological and climate debts, but also colonial debts and reproductive debts. It means to reverse the question of who owes who and to make shame change sides, not only in terms of gender violence, as Gisèle Pericot has famously suggested, but also in terms of colonial violence, racial violence, and ecocide. Eco-territorial internationalism means that in order to build pathways toward climate justice, we do not have to wait for the UNFCCC achieving a globally just loss and damage fund, which is very unlikely to occur given the relations of forces around the UNFCCC. It means that we have to embrace multi-actor strategies to acknowledge that the struggle involves all spatial scales, with the smallest scale being our own body and the largest being the global. That all those scales are interconnected, interdependent, and relevant. That structural change has to go hand in hand with cultural change, where we rebuild communities in which people can experience how well-being can mean something else than financial affluence. How well-being can be about the quality of relations, about mutual care and support, about lives free of violence, about rebalancing our relations with ecosystems. I can think of a number of constituencies that could engage in peoples-to-peoples solidary horizontal relations here and now around climate justice, for example. Municipalities in the global north with municipalities in the south, universities in the north with universities from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, renewable energy cooperatives from Catalonia with renewable energy cooperatives in those regions. Of course, in order for these relations to become horizontal, they will have to challenge the pre-established channels for such relations that are structured in an asymmetric way. Those of development aid, the channel of research projects for the EU and centered on the interest of the EU, the channels of carbon emission offsets that are profitable for the North, and so on. I want to suggest the perspective of reparations as a guiding principle, or even as a new paradigm for radically different transformative North-South relations. Historically, actually, if we look back, reparations have emerged being for the powerful. For example, in the 19th century, when slave trade and slavery was abolished, several countries incurred into relevant debt in order to repair the former slave owners for their loss. Also, after World War II, it was the victorious countries that imposed reparations on Germany. After World War I, after World War II, for the first time, reparations were paid to Jewish victims of the Holocaust. So it was the first time a group of victims got reparations, but not all groups of victims of the war got them, because that was dependent on the support, again, of victorious geopolitical powers, especially the US. It's only since the 1990s that debates on reparations rise for social groups that have suffered historical injustices in a broader understanding. Around, for example, the end of apartheid in South Africa, around the end of the civil war in Guatemala, and the respective truth commissions. Several normative settings exist framed by different bodies about the dimensions that reparations should entail, and I don't want to go too deep into that. But one important one is the acknowledgement of harm done, and another very important one is the guarantee of non-repetition. There are also many debates about who should benefit of these reparations. For example, in the US, you now have this discussion about if it's only the biological descendants of actual slaves, or if it is all African American people because they have suffered structural discrimination. And then we have the debates that concern us more here. The notions of ecological debt and climate debt have been around since the 90s, but the debate on climate reparations, I sense, has only gained traction in the last years. There have been several efforts to valorize the losses, to put numbers on what is owed by whom, and ecological economics has played an important role in that. But I think it is African-American philosopher Olufemi Taiwo who has opened a kind of discursive gateway with his 2022 book, Reconsidering Reparations. And one of his big contributions is that he questions the priority focus on reparations as paying something to someone, be it individual monetary compensation or state monetary compensation, and that he advocates to open that up toward structural dimensions of reparations because of the guarantee of non-repetition of harm. And he links them with Adam Getachev's stimulating concept of world making. Now, this is not just important as a new discourse. There are several ongoing struggles about reparations in the Global South today. And I would like to give two examples. One is the struggle for the Yasuni National Park in the Amazon of Ecuador, which still goes on. I guess most of you have known about that, after having won the 2023 referendum with 60% of the national vote. Yet the Yasuni territory has to be repaired now in a very material way, removing the oil infrastructure installed there since 2016 in a part of the territory, restoring the forest, rebreeding the fauna. And recently, the Waorani peoples, the ancestral indigenous dwellers of the Yasuni, one of these groups, set up a new trust fund called Wao Yasuni just 2 months ago, where they ask to not only the Ecuadorian state, but also the Mestizo majority society and the international community to contribute to repair the ongoing emergency they are facing in their territory for several reasons. One of them is oil. Another example is the Pan-African eco-feminist organization WUMIN. They work with grassroots women affected by development mega projects in 6 West African countries, mega projects like mining projects or hydropower dams financed by the African Development Bank. And their strategy is ecofeminist cost analysis from below in a participatory way as a popular education tool to make the harm visible and graspable and nameable for those women who are being dispossessed. And the intention is to channel that into a continental campaign for reparations directed to the African Development Bank. So this kind of processes needs our attention and needs our solidarity and needs our engagement. And it's not so much about doing research about that. It's about working with them and producing the needed knowledge together with them. So here we are, discussing green colonialism and green sacrifice for 2 days. And I invite you to also think about how to repair these sacrifice zones. Which kinds of multidimensional reparations would be needed in order to move toward intersectional global justice? Thank you.
So I go now straight? Okay. Perfect. Okay. Hang on 1 second. Let me just put this thing. So first of all, that was great. Thank you very much, Miriam, for that brilliant intervention. It's a bit difficult to follow that. And just so you know, and this is not Miriam's fault, I'm not blaming her for this at all. I read this at 1 a.m. So I was trying to create a dialogue with what Miriam said. So you will have to be patient with me in case sometimes my English might be broken or stuff might be weird, but I think we could definitely discuss that as we go along. So yes, thank you for that. First, to the organizers for this opportunity to be here to talk to you. It means a great deal to me, especially following this powerful intervention by Miriam. I'd like to offer some reflections that build on her call to think beyond development and to recognize what is often framed as this green transition capitalism rupture is, and which is in fact a reorganization and intensification of capitalism's core logics. As Miriam said, green colonialism has deep roots. Its origins lies in the long and ongoing history of extraction, of capitalist expansion and developmentalism. From the very beginning, capitalism has been grounded in extraction, unequal ecological exchange, and racialized hierarchies. These are not side effects of capitalism, or the famous word we hate, externalities, but these are its foundational mechanisms. These dynamics have shaped the modern state foundation, knowledge systems and regimes of classification and erasure. As Silvia Federici said it so insightfully, the witch hunt marked the key moment in the consolidation of the modern state as a self-contained apparatus of control. Thinkers, I think, like Enrique Dussel, Ivan Illich, also showed that how this period crystallized this universalizing project of modernity and its imposition through institutional violence and epistemic domination. So, I think today's green turn is not a break from that history, it is its latest mutation. Capitalism reliance on what indigenous scholar Liane Beta Samusake Simpson, apologies if I said that incorrectly, calls the extractive assimilation nexus, continues to expand commodity frontiers, but is now running up against both its external and internal limits. By this I mean the famous planetary boundaries we all know and share, understand, but it also is running up against the problem that capitalism, because of its reliance on machines and automation, is not requiring people at all. Yes, it's increasing the need, the excess population, let's say, that it already had in the global south. So, in this context, I think the language of transition functions as a new vocabulary of colonialism. It packages continuity as change. In fact, the energy transition may be the clearest example of what Illich called the ideas, Ivan Illich called the ideas of plastic words, terms that appear progressive or benign, but conceal the reproduction of dependency, control, and the loss of autonomy. And Jean-Baptiste Fressos, who Miriam also mentioned in her intervention, has argued pretty well that the transition itself might be the archetypical euphemism of neoliberalism. Yeah, it was the first time that the many euphemisms that came later, like sustainability, resilience, mitigation, adaptation, etc., even renewable energy, and just to follow up on this idea that Miriam was also bringing in, that there is no real sustainability. I think this is something that Alexander and I have also tried to put out, is that there is no renewable energy under capitalism. Yeah. The only renewable energy that exists under capitalism is the people's capacity to organize and resist it. So neoliberal capitalism has become an expert in adopting these flexible feel-good concepts that masks its ongoing violence. What is striking is also how this narrative of substitution, that was originally thought about engines and machines, was translated into the energy sources discourse, which makes to me no sense, but it's what we reproduce every day. Rather than reducing energy demand or questioning its premises, the system has embraced a logic of, as Fresos calls it, a symbiotic increase of all energy sources. What we are witnessing is not a transition from fossil fuels, but a symbiotic expansion of all of those forms that sustain fossil extraction. So capitalism, as always, grows through accumulation by intensification. I think one way to put this, or to frame this differently, is a way that a colleague of ours and also a co-editor of that book that Miriam mentioned at the beginning, Breno Bringel, calls it fossil gatopardism. This idea that nothing changes, so everything changes, or everything stays the same. Yeah, a reconfiguration of capitalism that presents itself as a decarbonization while preserving the foundational structures of extractivism. So this new green consensus is framed as inevitable, and I think it gives a new life to that infamous phrase that Margaret Thatcher used once, to call it, there is no alternative, right? If you go to the COP systems, if you follow all of these discussions, you will see that presidents of the COP actually say like, oh, the fossil fuels are a gift from God, so we have to exploit them. There is no alternative. Let's just be realistic and accept that. So I think that's one of the things we have to call out. Yes, this moment, I think, cannot be reduced to just simply saying, oh, it's a continuation of fossil capitalism. There's even people calling it fossil fascism now. These terms, I think, are important, but they risk narrowing the focus to just fossil fuels and not talking about how central other ways of extraction, the commodity chains, mining, infrastructure, etc., are essential to that form of capital. So if we fixate solely on the fossil aspect, we risk obscuring the deeper patterns of that extraction, a systemic logic of total extraction that defined the capitalist mode of organization. So perhaps what we are facing is better described as a system of total extractive fascism, maybe, or even more precisely as disaster nationalism, borrowing the term from Richard Seymour. This is a formation in which socio-ecological collapse, state militarizations, and necropolitical governance converge as strategic adaptations to the crisis. And I think we must be careful with the term fascism, but because we are definitely seeing a turn towards authoritarianism, sacrificial politics that are fully compatible with this idea of green capitalism or colonialism. Yes, so I think today, sacrifice is no longer confined to the peripheries of the global south. This is also one point I think is very well stressed in the book. It has become a systemic and universalized. The traditional distinction between legality and illegality, also what Miriam also said with the cartels and the organized groups, I think has become central to the systems of extraction of capital. As theories like Anselm Jappe and Nancy Fraser reminds us, capitalism no longer extracts solely from the labor and its surplus. It now consumes the entire fabric of social reproduction, right? It penetrates every domain of life, from care to housework to non-human nature and the psyche. Nothing is exempted from this commodification, and nothing is outside the reach of extraction. So I probably will skip that because I'm going too slow. But maybe just point out two things that I want to bring out from this as well. One is that this landscape should bring our attention to the state. I think we must rethink the role of the state in this continuum form of green colonialism extractivism. Rather than viewing the state as a neutral tool or a potential ally, I think we should recognize it, as Luis Tapia, for example, the Bolivian thinker, calls it, as an epistemological obstacle. our imaginaries of transformation, of articulation of what is possible and one can change are captured by the state. We are, I think, obsessed with the state. And that's something maybe not all of us have here, but the majority of people do. If I just went to a degrowth conference in Norway, and I think that's become very clear. So I think we should see the state as a mechanism of organized dependency. In this light, the reproductive politics, the reparative politics that Miriam calls out or calls for, centered on autonomy, care, and collective repair, become all the more urgent. Asking the state for more rights, particularly in domains like energy, for example, often reinforces the very systems that produce inequality. What does it mean, for instance, to modernize energy access through institutions whose logic depends on extractivism and centralization? Might such demands, however well-meaning, extend the war of subsistence that, for example, Ivan Illich called, rather than dismantle it? So I think when we speak of colonialism and extractivism, I think we should not separate those terms, and this is my next point, which I probably will end on, because I think most people have now pushed, for example, to move, abandon extractivism, just talk about colonialism, or some others have maybe pushed a little bit also to say, hey, maybe we go back to imperialism, right? Is the final logic of the broader logic of colonialism. Instead, I would caution against abandoning extractivism too quickly. First, because extraction is not just an economic activity. It is a worldview. It is a way of seeing and organizing the world, what is invisibilized by this form of extraction in capital. It imposes a single metric of value over all others. And second, because abandoning the term too easily can reproduce a north-south binary that overlooks the power asymmetries in the South itself. So for example, we must be able to critique Nicolás Maduro as a dictator and also call out US imperialism, but not do the one or the other, you know? Because otherwise, I think we're doing a very partial analysis of this thing. So, in this spirit, and I will end with this, because I know I'm running out of time, I think I followed this call for the eco-territorial internationalism that Breno Bringel and Sabrina Fernandez, but also Miriam is calling here. And I think maybe we should also consider going back to this idea what Ivan Illich called vernacular values, ways of living, knowing, and organizing that emerge precisely in the frictions, the points of contacts between worlds. These frictions, I think, are generative dissonances. They shape our political ecologies, our understanding of justice, and our capacities to build prefigurative autonomies. From forms of life and governance that allows us to navigate the present relationship with the state without reproducing its colonial capitalist logics. So I think we must confront that machinery through also thinking of how capitalism continues to pollute our desires. As Mark Fisher famously thought, the problem is not that capitalism is losing its grip on the imagination, but that it's still saturating that imagination. Today, if you look at, for example, the testimonies of Silicon Valley in the US Congress, executives speak of artificial intelligence as a project beyond the human, as something that exceeds the value of humanity itself and that justifies without question its enormous use of energy, water, and material resources. That fantasy of abundance and substitution, once marked through the liberal promises of inclusion and progress, has now given way to a harsher, more cynical configuration, what we call disaster nationalism, atmospheric colonialism, green colonialism, and militarized technology. These masks of post-war development, the world we lived in, I think are slowly coming apart. And with that, basically, I would just like to insist that these forms of reparation that Miriam was calling out are, I think, essential when we consider a pluriversal alternative to this vision of modernity. Why pluriversal? Because I think also the critique is that we are sometimes romanticizing the small, we are obsessed with the little, we can't go from the scale and push it up to a system that would make a systemic transformation. I think that idea is ridiculous, because if we think of a whole system that would be able to substitute capitalism in that scale, it's unviable. It would necessarily fall back on authoritarianism, yes? So I think the pluriverse, what it entails is that possibility of many's to exist and coexist through together. Amir Cesaire, the Dominican thinker, once put it beautifully. I think when he argued for a pluriverse, he said, it's not a single form of alternative that I'm interested in, but a constellation informed by the many particulars. Yeah, and I think that is key to bring out. Otherwise, we will still be trapped by this idea that we have to scale everything up, to transform everything from above, and to do things in a scale that is unmanageable. So besides the local, I think this idea of reparations brings into dialogue what we should also call out for those other worldings that become possible. So I hope I was more or less clear with that. Thank you.
So we will open it up to questions now. Questions, comments, reflections, reactions. We have one here. Let's see if we can get like 2 or 3. 2 here. Let's see if we can get more gender balance as well. In case, but not obligatory right now. Gender balance. Joanne.
Sorry, Christos, I would like to ask people that they just say their names and where they're from so that we can begin to weave in this room.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we're not gonna push it. 1, 2, 3.
Hello, my name is Marcel. I'm from Girona, very nearby here, and I work at ICTA UAB. I want to address the question of the gated communities, the freedom cities. And I want to say that capitalism knows no islands. There's no islands in capitalism. And as much as they try, there will never be islands in capitalism. Capitalism is a globalizing force because it needs to expand the sources of accumulation. And in that accumulation also lies the dependencies and the vulnerabilities of capitalism and those at the top. Because life will always emerge from the land, from the water, from the networks of life that exist. And I think we have to acknowledge that the power of the bottom as well is in cutting those flows, because those material flows is what can harm and can challenge this accumulation. And I think in relation to that, I'm bringing this as a context to bring up the increase to 5% of the GDP in military expenditure by NATO. And this is precisely to defend and protect those flows of life concentrating in the north. And we can see in the US interest in Greenland, the US attacks on the Houthis to protect the flows through the Red Sea, the UK arming Saudi Arabia to protect those flows, to protect the Hormuz Strait, etc. And 5% of GDP is 25% of public spending. 1 out of 4 dollars is going of public spending is going to the militaries right now. Well, that's what they're trying. So I think we should integrate the militarization of the world into these global green and black and brown capitalism as well. Thanks.
Hello, good morning. So I would like to add 2 things to your interesting presentation. So the first one is the positive one, and the idea of including an overall debate in this conference, which is a debate on the relationship between green colonialism and the far right. I think there are more links than the idea of climate apartheid and so on. So you give the introduction to the things that I think we must discuss within the whole conference. Otherwise, we will have the problem of talking of a thing of the last century. So this is actual. Green colonialism is actual because it's also very well related to the far right, from my point of view, according to many questions. So that's my position, and I would like to know also your ideas around that. And the second question is around the political scope, so the political approach of our alternatives. I don't agree with the idea of being in the middle between from the white position of the north, even we, as we are from the peripheries. I mean, you, me, and other people here. I'm not sure about how to manage the difficulties of understanding what's going on the anti-colonial fights in the south and in the peripheries. What I mean is that I don't believe and I don't agree that it's the same thing talking about Venezuela and Ecuador now. We cannot do the same. We cannot consider them as the same question, because there are many differences, as well as we cannot say the same thing on progressive governments and non-progressive governance in Latin America. We need to make the difference. Even they both are producing a lot of conflicts, have a lot of problems, are developing authoritarianism, etc. And the last question is, what is the right of colonialized people to resist? And those people who are inferiorized or racialized. So what I mean here is now, what is the right to defend? If we can say the same thing on Hamas, does anyone in this room will not understand the right of the Palestinian people to defend themselves with the arms, including these people? So this is a big contradiction, but I think we need to consider that and consider the right of the people to defend themselves as anti-colonial people. And this is the same debate. So I think that we need to consider these questions, and we need to understand and to listen to the people in the South of what they are developing, and then we will discuss how to solve these questions. But if we need a big alliance within the people in the South, with the people from the peripheries and with the people from the North, including the negatively racialized people in the North, we need to consider all these things and have a decolonial approach. Otherwise, we will be suffering on the future. That's my position. Thank you very much.
John Martinez again. I remember that question that somebody asked a long time ago. What is the ecology in political ecology? So I'm going to go back to ecology. And I'm going to go back to, as you see in this picture here, there are lots of windmills and solar panels. And I think that what is going to happen soon, although oil is still going up, and we read Fresso and so on, coal is probably at the peak, probably going down, depends on China. And it's quite likely, I think, that instead of 40 billion tons of CO2 per year, also taking into account the population, human population is not growing anymore, we are going to go back down to perhaps 20,000. And this will be too late for climate change. It's going to go up to 450 parts per million without any doubt. But it will mean a change. And this change should be taken into account because the economy is not circular, it is entropic, as Georges Courregan said. And this will mean to diminish by half the extraction of oil, coal, and gas altogether. But this new extraction is going to take place at the frontiers of extraction. And the copper which is going to be used, copper is only recycled about 30%. So more, you don't need more copper, just the current use of copper, which is dissipated or lost 70% all the time. So we need new copper coming in. The same for nickel, the same for lithium. This means this expansion of capitalism, of the industrial economy, I think we should also say, to the frontiers of extraction. And the frontiers of extraction is full of people and other species, actually. The other species protest a little bit, but we don't know exactly what they say. But humans complain. In Greenland, they're going to complain, in the Arctic, in the Amazon. And this is the environmental justice movement around the world, which of course can intersect, and this intersecting with anti-colonialism, with ecofeminism more and more. But if you don't consider this expansion of the commodity frontiers, or you attribute it to the profit motive and the evilness of capitalism, and you don't look at the ecology, I think you're missing a great part of the story.
Thank you. Just to say, we've got some 20 minutes. Perhaps, keep it in mind with your answers if you want to be brief, because we already have people waiting for a second round. You're very popular, I'm sorry.
Oof, interesting. Thank you very much. Well, some ideas. I think I could maybe bounce off from what you said. First of all, I agree with what you were saying, that capitalism is not based on islands. Of course, there is always a necessary material energy input that would sustain it. The thing is, like, there are islands of production. So there are places where capitalism appears to be operating perfectly, you know, like extracting surplus value and doesn't appear to be doing anything else, right? The point is that those are islands that extend the sacrifice zones. And so I think that's also like the metabolic relation of places between them and how they become connected through sacrifice. It makes that thing like appear like capitalism can still exist in its traditional form. You know what I mean? But I agree with you. There's, I think, also very patriarchal logic in trying to like complete this dream of completely separating from nature, which I think is the actual aspect, which is impossible, of course. But I think that will make the island argument a little bit more complex, you know? But I like that. Yeah, about the far right. I also had a thing there, but I didn't say it because I was going too slow. But I think, yes, I think one of the things that the far right has done very well is like try to play on this, you know, nativistic nationalist problems and basically find a scapegoat that is easily blamable. And then like, but if you see the arguments that they are making is trying to build like a pristine past where we were better off. And what were the, you know, the values, the situations that enabled that way of being was like, oh, well, the hierarchies were better explored, you know, like the white people were on top and, you know, with feminism. So, you know, the queer movement, feminism, the black liberation, all of that disrupted that. So hence, if we revert from that, we should be better. So I think that's a very good way of capturing desire. It's a very easy explanation to the problem that we face. Like, oh, if we get rid of this, we will go back to this way of being that was perfect, you know? Because yes, of course, like commodity frontiers were not eroded, we were not experiencing all of those problems that capitalism is experiencing now. So that's the contradictory part, that if we do that now, it's impossible, because now we are in such a different moment of capitalism. But that idea of capturing that desire of that pristine past, I think, is what they have been great in doing. And I think that's why I also brought a little bit badly, but Mark Fisher into the conversation, right? That idea of like desire, how it's being captured by those movements, I think is something that we as, I don't know how we call ourselves anymore, the left, I don't know, whatever we are, the critics of the system, we should be thinking about that and critiquing that better, because they are doing a really good job in that sense, you know, educating people, bringing them in, you know, all of these like incels and trat wives and all of those movements. I mean, it blows my mind, but it's there, you know, I don't know. And I'll stop there.
Thanks. Actually, thanks to all of you for your interventions that point at some lacks and holes in what I have said, and that's normal. It's only 40 minutes. So I totally agree with what you say about militarization and that this has to be woven into our reading of today's world. I also agree that we have to acknowledge more the limits of extraction as they are materializing, for example, in Bolivia very strongly today. And I think we're close to that scenario too in Ecuador, and this will, yeah, include new challenges. I don't think, how can I say that? I agree with you that we shouldn't just equate progressive processes with processes led by the right in Latin America, but we have to step out of the eternal polarization around that. So when I do an analysis of how civil rights are being reduced significantly, and I actually see that Bukele is learning from Daniel Ortega and Ortega is learning from Bukele, then I have to say they are using the same instruments. And also, I would actually say that Venezuela and Nicaragua have a very special position and are not in the arc of progressism anymore. It's just something else, yeah? So we can discuss Colombia, we can discuss Mexico, we can discuss Chile. I am absolutely not in favor of passing all through the same lens. For example, when we have electoral campaigns between Correísmo and Novoísmo in Ecuador, for me, it's not the same. But we also have to acknowledge when authoritarianism cuts across those ideological houses. And yes, I think we will face a lot more debates about people from the South and their right to defend themselves. And I think that also in that way, on that topic, I would advocate to embrace some leading principles that can be guiding for our alliances beyond ideological locked worlds. The debate on Hamas and Israel and Palestine has been rather unbearable for me in the last years, in Europe especially. And what I tried to set out is those leading principles that would more or less orient us with whom in the Palestinian world we have to establish relations and strengthen their positions because they are emancipatory and democratic and non-patriarchal actors, and with whom also in Israeli societies we actually can be solidary even today because they are risking their lives for justice. That would be my point on that.
Okay, I'm trying to be fast. Yeah, hi, my name is Anna from the University of Hamburg. I wanted to ask you how you think about the role of China when speaking about green colonialism. I think, for example, about like huge nickel parks in Indonesia that were established based on an agreement between Jokowi and Xi Jinping, but where also like a lot of Chinese workers are especially working under slave-like conditions. But then I also think about like how the solar PV production in China has contributed to much lower prices that are also important for progressive like solar cooperatives, for example, like all this complexity. And I was wondering like if like the term or the concept of green colonialism potentially obscures some of the complexities we witness in these kinds of processes. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Miriam and Carlos. You know, I'm fans of your work, so thank you. And of course, I am just so happy to hear there's no just transitions, there's no such thing as transition. Frezzo, who I love, but three things that oh yeah, I'm sorry. I'm Xander, I guess I'm at Boston University. But there's just three things I wanna say as quick as possible since, but I just wanna stress that there have been people in the forest among other places in Europe who have been actively fighting, sabotaging and destroying and going after green capitalism in a very real way that academia, even among different environmental movements, have been very happy to ignore. But there's been there's been a fight here in a very real way that I'm been annoyed, as at least some people know, for many years now, that this has been going on, whether it's Hambach Forest, whether it's the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline in Italy, and it's ironic that the green capitalist critique coming from related to hydrocarbon infrastructures and projects, because they're actively starting to greenwash all this stuff since 2010 at least. And again, it's so great to hear Jean-Baptiste Frezzo, but that critique has been with Christophe Benoit, that's been around since 2016, and those are just the scholars I know who did it. So this has been something that's been well established for at least 9 years, and I think even longer in French, and so it's been really frustrating to not see this, take this long for it to be kind of spoken about like this, even if I am extremely happy about it. And then I think, and finally, the thing that I think is challenging, and I'm very happy when you talk about reparations and how this was ultimately a French colonial technology from Haiti to pretty much screw the insurgents over. I think we can't talk about the global South and pretend like these governments, as Max Asia said the other day, are, you know, for their people. This idea that these governments are for their people, whether North or South, is crazy. And I think there needs to be a lot more consideration about what these governments are doing, how funds are being used, and what the real objectives of governmental systems and these things are. And so with that, I am finished.
Yes, thanks. Uli, please, can you present yourself?
Yes, I'm Uli from Vienna, currently also at Hamburg University. Since it's the opening session, thank you very much for those two brilliant presentations and comments. Three conceptual remarks, and then maybe we can also discuss it during the conference. The first is that I'm a bit uncomfortable with the term decarbonization consensus. I already discussed it also with Breno and Maristella, because consensus means, in a Gramscian critical sense, really broadly accepted and a material practice. And you show that it's decarbonization is an addition to carbonization. So I think commodity consensus was a great concept by Maristella Swamper, but decarbonization consensus is a bit misleading. The second is this debate on fascism. What we are discussing now in Germany and Austria is fascization, a process, and to discuss the criteria, and maybe we have time here also in other opportunities. What are the criteria? What is the dehumanization about? What is fake news, propaganda, etc., etc.? But I am more comfortable to call it fascization. And finally, since you mentioned, Carlos, the obsession with the state in Oslo, when we proceed with this debate, I would insist that we understand from the very beginning the state as a multiscalar social relation. Because when we listen to the state, we think usually the nation state. No, we have a local state, we are in Barcelona, we have regional states, we have an international forms of the state. So just a conceptual remark that we have this in mind, and then also to when we think about counter-hegemonic strategies, what are the current scales which are worth fighting at? Yeah, maybe not so much the international level, but maybe very much the local level and the communal level. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Cameron Louder. I'm currently a graduate student at Columbia University. And thank you for both of your what you talked about. So on the topic of reparations, of course, being a Black American and being owed reparations for centuries of unpaid labor by my ancestors, I wanted to mention that when you asked what reparations may look like, at least in this case, and honestly, globally, I think beyond just acknowledgement of past injustices and stating or promising to not do it again, I don't think that's personally enough. I think that efforts should be made towards harmony restoration. And personally, I think an important aspect of that would be whether that's possession of land or also of health, because as we know, there's systemic powers that continue to subjugate people who have been wronged historically. So I think it's important to put systemic efforts into ameliorating those conditions. Thank you.
Thanks. Vatsna Ramasa from Lund University. And maybe just continuing on from this question of reparations, I was going to ask you, Miriam, to expand on it, because who is asking for reparations to whom? What do we think is actually going to come from that? What is the role of people in the global north who are allies in a reparation process? When we've talked of the violences that exist, where is the actual space for reparations to be meaningful?
It was just that Noura, and I am Palestinian. I work at Radboud University. So just to continue on Vasna's, just how do we think of reparations in a moment of a genocide? It's a very difficult time for us Palestinians, and the damage is irreversible. So it's very difficult for us, like for me, I speak collectively of the community that I belong to think of like a reparation while we are being eliminated for almost 2 years. And it's an irreversible elimination, destruction. I agree with you when you discussed about the material, like the land, but this is something that Palestinians have been fighting for when we think of the right of return for the Palestinian refugees because of the Nakba of 1948, where we Palestinians have the right to return to their original homelands and villages or get compensation, but until today, Israel does not even acknowledge the existence of this stipulated UN right. So how does it work, really? I'm really losing hope. I don't think it's enough just to acknowledge, because again, we're talking about elimination, now, at this second, happening. I think this is a moment that we really need to rethink how do we live with ourselves in this moment of genocide? And how do we rethink all these kind of geopolitical powers? And what do you mean by allies when you just said before, we have to think of to connect with Palestinians, the emancipatory Palestinians? I didn't understand that point. Like, are we picking certain people? And also, what about the boycott on Israel, the sanctions, the divestment? So I think, yeah, I'm happy to think more about reparations in times of genocide.
Wow, that was a package. Well, Anna, the role of China, I think, is much more challenging than we can measure it. And I think, yeah, it is very little debated in Latin America in this. Well, there are some strands, but too little, really. And what I have learned some years ago when I went to China was first that many people were not critical at all of an imperial understanding of themselves. It was like very natural for them to be an empire. They always had been an empire and it was not conflictive. And that they were very concerned about getting their own environmental conditions better and have been very effective with that, and very little concerned about environmental conditions in other parts of the world. So it was very difficult to even engage in a discussion about what is going on around Chinese projects in Latin America. So I think I'm too far away to really understand how Chinese people think. But I do think that we should explore how it is really relating to the rest of the world. I think, for me, China is not a part of the Global South anymore, although the IMF still categorizes it there. It is one part of the world powers who externalize their social and environmental costs to elsewhere, who also externalize at that point of history bad working conditions and bad health conditions through exploitative work to Africa, for example. So, but it's this huge black box for all debates in the West where Latin America is part of. So I would be very careful with that. Xander, sabotage and direct action, yes. I think, the only thing I do not sympathize with are calls to action from academia, which are like irresponsible in these times. I don't talk of you, but I very much sympathize and have walked with people who block coal mining in Germany or oil extraction in Ecuador. And I think it is a necessary dimension of struggles today as in the past. Uli, thanks for pointing out the thing with the decarbonization consensus, which I actually share. This is why I always say this concept introduced by. I think, yeah, it has already shown that it has not gained the traction that maybe was well, they tried to predict a couple of years ago. And around the state, I think we agree there is nothing to say about that. It's very important to also maybe de-ideologize the debate about the state. It's never a yes or no and everything or nothing. It's also learning from processes on the ground and in which ways they engage successfully with certain state constituencies, and then there is a whole possibility, range of possibilities we can learn from. But I also agree that in this ideological discussion, there is actually the epistemologic obstacle that you mentioned, which is somehow blocking. And what's most interesting from your interpellations, Uli, is the thing about fascism. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I somehow refrain from using the term for today's processes, but not because I think we're not there yet and it's not as bad as, or some comparative relativization, but because I think it can be a trap to use a term that has emerged in a different historical context, in different social dynamics, to describe what is happening today. So I would prefer we could come up with another term that actually frames this and doesn't tie us so much to the past and to certain countries and threads of thought of the past. So I don't know if fascisation helps for that, actually. And I use muletas to walk to describe what is happening right now until someone has the idea. Yeah. I agree with you. The only thing that worries me is that, for example, in the Amazon, you have this, like the land back dynamics that you can actually observe is people getting their land legalized only for new carbon credits. So it's again recaptured into a new cycle of extraction and value creation, which is rather sad. So not even this is something we can just rely on and say that we should fight for. And Vasna, well, as I tried to outline with those two examples I gave, my proposal is to connect with actual struggles around reparations and engage with them in a dialogue of what can be the role of people in the global north, but in a very concrete way. And I was a bit struck in Oslo now at the Degrowth Conference, where I also have been. There was a whole new young movement calling for delinking, and delinking was all over the place. And at some moment said, I don't really understand, what is your role being from the North in delinking? Isn't that something the South has to do for itself? And it's a motivating concept, yes, but maybe you would want to think about what it would mean to delink Europe from the rest of the world, and maybe work on that, like be responsible for your own turf. And so I think that the whole direction of thinking rather in reparations and what do I owe to whom, and how can I put my privilege into circulation and this kind of stuff is more productive. Thanks for putting this on the table. I think where genocide happens, words are always difficult to find, action too. I agree with this sense of irreversibility and end and pain. And I would wish we could come up with something as a collective here to at least, not let it pass, but still we have to get up every day and struggle, even in this event. So I think we're in the middle of a debate on what reparations can mean and should mean, and thank you for that, because this is exactly what I wanted to throw into the room.